The sound of the saxophone drifted through the heavy air like a dream refusing to die. It was late afternoon, American prisoner of war camp near the outskirts of Manila. The war was limping toward its bitter end, and in the yard, hundreds of Japanese prisoners, men and women, sat in silence, their faces gaunt from hunger, their eyes hollow from the collapse of everything they had once believed eternal. The guards had gathered them together not for punishment, but for something different. In the middle of the yard, a few American soldiers were setting up battered instruments, an old trumpet, a dented trombone, a war-scarred drum set, and a saxophone that gleamed faintly in the dying light. The prisoners whispered among themselves. They had heard of American music before, rumors of strange rhythms and melodies that defied order, but none of them had ever truly heard it. They expected perhaps a march or a hymn, something stern, perhaps even victorious, but what came next felt like something from another world. The drummer tapped a slow rhythm, and the saxophone began to sing. A sound alive with movement, with life, with something utterly foreign to the ears of those who had spent years under military orders and sirens. It was jazz. It was freedom wrapped in sound. The melody danced, twisted, and shimmered, refusing to obey any structure the prisoners recognized. The wind carried it over the barbed wire, and into the fading sun, and for the first time in months, even the guards seemed to breathe differently. The women seated on the rough ground exchanged uncertain glances. Among them sat a woman named Aiko Nakamura, her uniform faded and too large for her slender frame. Once a nurse in the Japanese Red Cross, she had been captured during the chaotic fall of Manila after trying to save wounded soldiers left behind. Her hands, once gentle instruments of healing, now trembled with exhaustion. As the music swelled, Aiko lifted her head. Something deep inside her stirred, something she had buried under years of discipline and duty. She had once loved music. As a girl in Tokyo, before the war, she had played piano in her family's small home. Her father had taught her a few Western songs, simple melodies from across the ocean, though he always warned her never to speak too loudly about them. Western things, he had said, were dangerous in those years. But now, here she was, surrounded by American soldiers, hearing that forbidden sound echo freely in the open air. She pressed her hands to her mouth, as if to contain the flood of emotion. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even sadness. It was something much more fragile, a reminder of life before the world broke. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and she let it fall. Around her, others were beginning to react too. Some women stared blankly, unsure how to process what they felt. A few closed their eyes. One began to hum quietly, as if afraid the sound might vanish if left alone. The camp guards exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected such reactions. To them, the music was a casual performance, a way to pass the time. But to the prisoners, it was an alien kindness, a bridge that shouldn't exist between enemy and captive. The band played in the mood. The saxophone leapt playfully through the air, teasing, joyful, irreverent. The drummer's sticks rattled like laughter. Aiko felt her breath hitch as the rhythm caught her heartbeat and refused to let go. She thought of her younger brother Haruto, who had enlisted in the Imperial Army before the war reached its peak. He had written her once, describing the heat of Burma, the endless marches, and the sound of cicadas that screamed louder than gunfire. His last letter arrived, and after that, silence. She had told herself he was still alive, that perhaps he had been reassigned somewhere far away. But as the music played, she knew the truth she had denied. The war had swallowed him too. Private James Holden, one of the American guards, watched the scene quietly from his post near the fence. He was 22, from Chicago, a mechanic before the draft took him across the Pacific. He had fought through the Philippines campaign and had seen too much to still believe in simple categories like good and evil. When he first saw the Japanese prisoners, especially the women, he expected hatred to rise in him. After all, his older brother had died on Iwo Jima. But when he looked at them, he saw nothing but exhaustion and humanity stripped bare. And when the jazz band began to play, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. People remembering they were still alive. Holden's fingers tapped unconsciously against his rifle in rhythm with the music. He thought of home, the smoky jazz bars of Chicago, the laughter of his friends, the sound of his mother humming Moonlight Serenade as she cooked dinner, the same song perhaps that now made these former enemies cry. The irony didn't escape him. War made enemies out of strangers, but music somehow made strangers into mirrors. As the band finished their first piece, silence hung in the air, not the stiff silence of discipline, but something sacred. The women didn't clap, unsure if it was allowed. The Americans didn't expect applause either, but then one faint sound broke through. A single voice humming softly. The same melody that had just ended. Heads turned. It was Aiko. Her eyes were closed, her lips trembling as she followed the tune in perfect pitch. The guards didn't stop her. The other women, encouraged by her courage, began to hum too. Soon the air filled again with the fragile echo of human voices blending with memory. The sergeant in charge, a gruff man named Wilson, didn't know what to do. Well, he muttered, scratching his head. Guess they liked it. Holden smiled faintly. Guess they needed it. When evening came and the prisoners were herded back to their barracks, the sky blazed in a deep orange hue. Aiko sat near the window of the bamboo hut, still hearing the echo of that saxophone. She had almost forgotten what beauty sounded like. For years her ears had been filled with commands, explosions, and screams. But now, there was rhythm again, life again. She whispered quietly, "Ongako wa ikateru." Music lit. That night she dreamed she was back in Tokyo, in her family's small home near Ueno Park. The piano was still there, its keys gleaming ivory white. Her mother laughed as she made tea. Her father sat reading the newspaper, pretending not to listen as she practiced. In her dream there was no war, no hunger, only peace. But then faintly she heard the wail of an air raid siren, and the dream began to crumble. She awoke to darkness, the sound of insects humming outside, and the faint murmur of guards talking near the fence. The next morning, the routine returned. The same rations, the same lineups, the same tired faces. But something invisible had changed. The prisoners spoke a little more softly, shared scraps of food, and even smiled. The Americans noticed it too. Captain Miller, the officer in charge, was a thoughtful man who believed discipline and humanity didn't have to cancel each other out. When the chaplain suggested organizing more performances to raise morale, Miller agreed. He said quietly, "Music's the only thing that doesn't take sides." So every few days the army band would return, sometimes playing blues, sometimes slow ballads, and once even a swing number that made a few of the younger guards start dancing awkwardly. The prisoners watched, half afraid to laugh, but unable to hide their fascination. Aiko, who had once been terrified to meet the eyes of her captors, began to notice Holden watching her, not with cruelty, not with pity, but with curiosity. During roll call one morning, their eyes met briefly. He gave a small nod. She hesitated, then returned it. In the days that followed, Holden found himself drawn to her presence. There was something dignified in her silence, something unbroken despite everything. One afternoon, while distributing water, he noticed she was struggling to lift a bucket. Without thinking, he stepped forward and helped. The other guards looked on, surprised. It wasn't against the rules, but it wasn't encouraged either. She looked up at him, startled, and managed to quiet arigato. He understood enough Japanese to nod and smile. "You're welcome." That night, when the band played again, Holden watched her more closely. The music this time was slower. Stardust. The melody floated like a lullaby. Aiko's lips moved, whispering the notes to herself. Holden realized she knew music better than most. When the song ended, he approached the band tent after his shift. "You got any spare sheet music?" he asked. The band leader, a cheerful sergeant from New Orleans, handed him a worn page. "Sure, buddy. That one's been through hell." "Why?" Holden only shrugged. "Maybe it'll mean something to someone." Back in the barracks, Aiko sat by the window again, the moonlight spilling across her thin hands. She heard footsteps and tensed. Holden appeared quietly at the doorway, holding something folded. "Here," he said softly, careful not to alarm her. "Music. For you." She looked at the paper as if it were a relic from another world. "Music," she whispered. He nodded. "Jazz. Maybe you can read it." He didn't stay. He simply handed it to her, and left before the guards could notice. When he was gone, Aiko unfolded the paper and ran her fingers over the faded ink. The notes were familiar, foreign, yet intimate. She traced them with trembling hands. Somewhere deep in her memory, the piano keys stirred again. She could almost feel their smooth touch beneath her fingers. For the first time in years she smiled, the small fragile curve of lips that carried the weight of survival. Outside, the guards laughed. The insects sang, and in the distance a trumpet began to play once more. The sound carried through the still night air, over the wire and into her heart. She closed her eyes, letting the rhythm wash through her, and whispered to the darkness that still lingered within her soul. Maybe there is still a world where music lives, and though the war was not yet fully over, though nations still counted their dead and cities still burned in ashes. In that small camp, for a few fleeting moments, humanity returned, carried not by victory or surrender, but by the trembling, unbreakable sound of jazz. The next morning began like any other inside the American-run internment camp. The dull clang of the morning bell, the shuffle of tired feet on dirt, the clipped commands from guards whose voices carried more fatigue than hostility. The prisoners, mostly women, nurses and clerical workers taken during the final collapse of the Japanese occupation in the Philippines, rose quietly, washed at the communal basins and lined up for the meager breakfast of rice and watery soup. The air smelled faintly of smoke and salt overhead. The sun climbed slow and heavy. Another day in captivity. But something invisible hung in the air since the night before. It wasn't the same silence of despair. It was thinner, lighter, like a wound beginning to close. Aiko Nakamura sat near the edge of the yard, her hands cupped around the tin bowl of soup. Her eyes were distant, but not hollow. Inside her pocket, hidden carefully, was the folded paper that Private Holden had given her. The worn sheet of jazz notes written in English script she could barely read. She hadn't dared show it to anyone. The paper felt sacred, fragile as memory. Every time she touched it, she felt the pulse of something alive. She had spent most of the night tracing the notes with her fingertips, whispering the sounds in her mind, remembering the feel of piano keys beneath her hands. After breakfast, the prisoners were assigned to work details. Some washed clothes for the guards. Others carried water or swept the barracks. Aiko volunteered for the infirmary, tending to the sick. It was a small, makeshift tent at the edge of the camp. She felt calmer there, among the quiet and the scent of soap and herbs. The American medic, Corporal Lewis, was a lanky man from Texas with a gentle drawl. He didn't speak much Japanese, but he respected her skill. They communicated through gestures and short phrases. "You nurse?" he'd asked once, pointing to her hands. She nodded. "Yes, nurse." Since then, he had treated her like a colleague, not just a prisoner. That morning, Lewis arrived carrying a small box of bandages and a radio. He placed it on a stool and fiddled with the knobs until a burst of static gave way to faint music. Aiko froze. It was jazz again, broadcast from the American military station in Manila. The rhythm was faint but recognizable, the gentle sway of a trumpet, the whisper of drums. She glanced around nervously, afraid someone might forbid it, but Lewis just smiled and kept working, humming along. He didn't realize what it meant to her. The sound filled the tent, curling through the damp air like incense. For a moment she forgot where she was. Her hands moved automatically as she cleaned a wound, her body following a rhythm only her heart understood. She thought of her piano, long gone in the bombings, and her mother's voice calling her in the evenings. She remembered laughter, the soft glow of lanterns outside their home, the way she and her brother used to sneak out to watch street performers playing shamisen near the park. The war had buried all that under rubble and ashes, but the music unearthed it piece by piece. Across the yard, Holden was on patrol. He walked slowly along the fence, his rifle slung over his shoulder, the sun glinting off his helmet. He caught faint strains of the radio and smiled when he recognized the tune, "Take the A Train." It was one of his favorites back home. For a second he imagined himself in Chicago again, sitting in a smoky bar, a drink in his hand, his friends laughing as the band played. The illusion broke when he turned and saw Aiko through the open flap of the infirmary tent. She was standing beside a cot, her face turned toward the sound, eyes closed, swaying slightly as if her body remembered a dance long forgotten. Holden felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't attraction, not yet. It was recognition. The quiet understanding of two people who had seen too much, and still longed for something pure. He walked away before she could notice him watching. Later that afternoon, the band returned. It had become a weekly ritual now. Captain Miller encouraged it, calling it a morale exercise. Even the guards seemed to look forward to it, if only because it broke the monotony. The prisoners were gathered again in the central yard. The sun was lower, the shadows stretching long. Aiko sat among the women, her heart already racing in anticipation. The band began with a slow piece, "Blue Moon." The trumpet wept softly, the notes drifting like mist. The prisoners sat still, absorbing it in silence. Then came a faster rhythm, bright, quick, and alive. One of the American soldiers started tapping his boots, and soon a few others joined, laughing quietly. The Japanese women stared at the sight, these men, their captors, laughing and moving freely. It was strange, almost unsettling, but also human. Aiko's eyes wandered until they found Holden standing near the edge of the crowd. He wasn't smiling or laughing, he was just watching, his gaze steady, calm. When she looked at him, he nodded slightly, as if to say, "Listen." The music rose and fell. A conversation without words. Somewhere in that rhythm, she began to understand what Holden had meant when he handed her that sheet of paper. Jazz wasn't just music. It was resistance. It was the refusal to let pain turn to silence. It was freedom disguised as melody. And for someone who had lived through years of strict obedience, where every movement, every word, every thought was controlled, that freedom was both terrifying and intoxicating. When the song ended, there was a strange quiet. The women didn't clap. They bowed their heads slightly, a gesture of gratitude they couldn't express in words. The band packed up their instruments, joking among themselves, but a few soldiers noticed the tears on the prisoners' faces. "They're crying again," one whispered. "Why do they cry every time?" Holden overheard and replied quietly, "Because they remember what it's like to be human." That night the camp settled into uneasy stillness. The guards took their shifts. The prisoners lay down on thin mats, and somewhere in the distance a storm rumbled over the mountains. Aiko couldn't sleep. She lay awake staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, the music still echoing in her mind. Her fingers itched for a piano that didn't exist. Finally she rose and stepped outside, wrapping her thin blanket around her shoulders. The camp was dark except for the dim lights near the fence. Holden was on night duty, leaning against a post, his rifle beside him. When he saw her, he straightened, surprised. "You shouldn't be out," he said softly. She hesitated, unsure if she'd understood his words, but his tone was kind, not harsh. "Music," she whispered, pointing toward the distance where the faint hum of thunder sounded like distant drums. "You play?" she asked carefully. Holden smiled.
"A little."
"Harmonica." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small harmonica, the metal glinting faintly in the light. "My brother taught me," he said. Then, without waiting for permission, he began to play. The tune was simple, almost lullaby-like. It wasn't jazz, just a soft, meandering melody that spoke of home. Aiko listened, her eyes wide. When he finished, she bowed her head. "Beautiful," she whispered. Then she touched her chest. "Arigato." He didn't reply, just nodded. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was peaceful, fragile, something both of them knew they couldn't explain. Over the next few weeks, the war officially ended. Rumors spread through the camp before the official announcement reached them. Japan had surrendered. Some of the prisoners refused to believe it. Others broke down in tears. For Aiko, it felt like losing something she had been forced to love, the identity of the empire that had consumed her life. But it also meant the world might begin again. When Captain Miller gathered the prisoners to tell them formally, he spoke slowly, through an interpreter. "The war is over," he said. "You are no longer our enemies. You are people just like us." His voice trembled slightly when he added, "May this be the beginning of something better." That evening, the band played again, but this time the tone was different. They played Over the Rainbow. The notes floated like prayers. Some of the women wept openly. Even some of the guards looked away, pretending to be busy. Holden stood beside the band, holding his helmet against his chest. He thought of his brother, buried far away on an island still scarred by gunfire. He thought of Aiko, sitting among the others, her face wet with tears but her eyes shining. As the song reached its final notes, a light drizzle began to fall. The rain mingled with tears, washing the dust from the prisoners' faces. Aiko tilted her head back, letting the drops touch her skin. She thought of her brother, her home, her lost piano. She whispered softly, "Maybe he can hear this too." After the performance, the prisoners were dismissed early. Holden lingered by the yard, unsure if he should approach her again. Finally he saw her walking slowly toward the barracks, her steps uncertain. He called out, "Aiko." She turned, startled that he used her name. He hesitated, then said, "Keep that music. Don't lose it." He gestured toward her pocket where he knew she kept the folded sheet. She nodded, clutching it tighter. That night, the camp radio played quietly from the guards' quarters. The jazz announcer's voice broke through the static. "This one goes out to all who made it home, and those who never did." The song that followed was "I'll Be Seeing You." Holden listened in silence. In the women's barracks, Aiko was awake too, humming the same tune under her breath. Two people, separated by wire and war, sharing the same melody in the same night, without knowing why it mattered so much, only that it did. The days after surrender were strange, filled with confusion and waiting. The prisoners no longer feared execution, but they didn't know when or if they would go home. Some Americans began leaving for new assignments. Others stayed until repatriation was arranged. Holden knew he would be leaving soon. He found himself avoiding Iko, unsure how to say goodbye, but fate, as it often did in those years, found its own moment. On his final day, as he packed his things, he looked at the harmonica lying on his cot. He picked it up, hesitated, then walked toward the women's section. The guards let him through. By now everyone knew he wasn't there for trouble. Aiko was in the infirmary again, cleaning bandages. When she saw him, she froze. He held out the harmonica. "For you," he said, "so you can have music, even without a piano." She stared at it, speechless. Finally she reached out and took it with both hands, bowing deeply. "Music never dies," she whispered in broken English. "Never." Holden smiled faintly. "No, it doesn't." Then, before she could respond, he saluted her softly, turned and walked away into the rain that had begun to fall again, leaving her standing there with the small silver harmonica shining in her hand. Inside the tent, the radio played faintly through the static. Another jazz song, one she didn't know. She held the harmonica close to her heart, listening, breathing, remembering. The war had taken everything, but it hadn't taken her ability to feel. It hadn't taken the music. The wind that swept across the camp that September morning carried a different kind of silence. The silence of endings. The guards no longer barked orders with the same edge. The prisoners no longer moved with the fearful obedience that once defined every step. There was exhaustion, confusion, and above all a strange, fragile sense of disbelief. The war that had devoured their youth was finally over. The surrender had been announced. The once proud empire had fallen. Yet in that quiet Philippine valley surrounded by barbed wire and rusting towers, time seemed to pause, uncertain what to do with the survivors who had outlasted the madness. Aiko awoke to the sound of rain tapping softly against the tin roof of the barracks. The air smelled of wet earth and ashes. She sat up slowly, her hands trembling as they brushed her hair away from her face. Her body felt light and heavy at the same time, as if something invisible had been lifted from her and yet another weight had replaced it. Around her the other women were waking too, murmuring softly to each other. Some cried openly, some stared blankly into the dim light. No one knew what would come next. She reached for her pocket and unfolded the two objects that had become her most precious possessions, the torn piece of jazz sheet music and the small silver harmonica Holden had given her before leaving. They were the only things she owned that didn't belong to war. She turned them over carefully, her reflection faint on the metal. Outside, the guards moved slowly, without tension, as if they too were unsure how to behave now that there was no enemy left to fight. A whistle blew for roll call. The prisoners lined up under the drizzle, their thin uniforms clinging to their skin. Captain Miller stood on a wooden platform with an interpreter beside him. His voice was solemn, his hat pulled low over his eyes. "The war is finished," he said. "You are free to go home soon. The ships will come. You will be treated, fed, and returned to Japan." His words, translated into Japanese, rippled through the crowd like distant thunder. Some of the women gasped. Others fell to their knees. Aiko stood perfectly still. Home. The word felt foreign on her tongue. What did home even mean now? The Japan she remembered of music, laughter, family was gone. The empire that had sent her here had crumbled. What awaited her on the other side of the sea was not the same country she had left. Later that day, when the rain eased, Captain Miller ordered the band to play one final time for the camp. He said it would be a gesture of farewell. The musicians gathered near the yard, their instruments glistening damp under the fading sun. The prisoners were allowed to sit wherever they wanted, men and women together for the first time. Some guards even sat among them. It felt unreal, as if the war itself had been a fever dream now breaking. The first song was soft and slow, a waltz from home. Then came a hymn, something gentle and almost holy. But when the band began to play Over the Rainbow, the mood changed entirely. The trumpet's voice rose high and trembling. The saxophone whispered underneath, and the drums brushed softly like footsteps on a quiet road. Aiko's heart clenched. She had heard this song once before, faintly, when the Americans celebrated their victory. Back then it had felt like a song of loss. Now it sounded like a promise. Around her, women began to weep, openly, without shame. The tears came not from defeat, but from release. For years they had been told to suppress emotion, to serve, to endure. Now the walls that duty had built inside them collapsed under the weight of the melody. Aiko felt her chest tighten as memories flooded her. Her mother's voice calling her home for dinner, her brother laughing in the snow, her piano, her father's hand resting gently on her shoulder, the night before she left for the military hospital. Each note tore through her like a blade and healed her all at once. Holden was gone now, sent to another post. But his memory lingered everywhere. The way he had looked at her not as an enemy, but as a person. The quiet strength in his voice, the gift of the harmonica she still held close. She imagined him hearing the same song somewhere, under a different sky. Perhaps he too thought of her, of the prisoners, of the strange humanity that had bloomed amid so much ruin. The music went on, each song melting into the next. When the band finished, Captain Miller stood again and spoke quietly. "You have survived," he said. "That is more than many can say. Remember that survival is not a shame. It is a duty to live better than before." The interpreter repeated his words. Some prisoners nodded, others stared blankly, unable to process them. Aiko felt them sink deep into her soul. Survival as duty, perhaps that was all she could do. Keep living, keep remembering, keep music alive. That night the camp was quieter than usual. The rain returned, steady and soft. Aiko sat alone by the small window of the barracks, the harmonica in her hands. She hesitated, then brought it to her lips. The first sound was weak, off-key, but she kept playing. She had never played before, but the notes came anyway, hesitant, trembling, alive. Some of the women stirred in their sleep. One turned over and smiled faintly. The tune drifted through the dark like a whisper of life, winding through the barracks, slipping through cracks, rising into the night sky where the clouds parted just enough for a few stars to show. In those small wavering notes, Aiko found something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of control, of creation, of self. The war had taken everything she had built, but it hadn't taken her ability to make something beautiful, no matter how fragile. The next morning when she went to work at the infirmary, Corporal Lewis noticed the circles under her eyes, and the harmonica peeking from her pocket. "You play now?" he asked with a grin. She nodded shyly. "Try," she said. He chuckled. "Well, don't stop. The world needs more music." As days turned into weeks, the camp changed. The fences were still there, but they felt less like prisons and more like boundaries waiting to open. The guards shared cigarettes with the prisoners. The Americans brought extra rations, small comforts, soap, fruit, even books. Aiko helped translate for some of the women who couldn't speak English, and slowly conversations began to bloom between captors and captives. Some of the older soldiers talked about their homes, their mothers, their wives. The women listened, sometimes sharing their own memories of home. The line between us and them blurred more each day. One afternoon, Lewis asked Aiko if she could help tend to a local Filipino child who had been injured near the camp. She agreed immediately. The boy had stepped on a rusted nail while scavenging for food. His foot was swollen and infected. Aiko cleaned the wound carefully, humming softly as she worked. The boy, frightened at first, stared up at her with wide eyes. When she finished, he whispered, "Thank you," in broken English. She smiled. It was the first time she had helped someone outside the boundaries of war since being captured. That evening, as she walked back, she saw a group of American soldiers sitting near the gate, listening to the radio. A newscaster's voice echoed faintly, talk of reconstruction, of peace treaties, of trials. The war was ending everywhere, but its shadows stretched long. She wondered if people back home hated Americans as much as they had been taught to. She wondered if they would hate her for having survived. When the ships finally arrived, there was both joy and fear. The prisoners were given clean clothes and meager rations for the journey. Aiko packed her few belongings carefully: a small notebook, the harmonica, and the folded music sheet. As they walked toward the pier under the watchful eyes of the guards, she looked back at the camp one last time. The wooden towers stood empty. The yard where the band had played was overgrown with grass. For a moment she thought she heard a faint echo. The saxophone, the laughter, the sound of rain mixing with music. At the dock, American soldiers helped the Japanese prisoners board the transport ship. The sea stretched wide and endless, glimmering beneath the pale sky. Aiko paused before stepping onto the ramp. She turned and saw Captain Miller standing nearby, his cap in his hand. "Safe voyage," he said simply. She bowed deeply. "Arigato." Then without another word she walked up the ramp, the harmonica clutched tight against her chest. The journey across the Pacific was long and quiet. The ship rocked gently, the air thick with salt and memory. The women slept in crowded bunks, their dreams haunted by home and ghosts. Aiko spent her nights on deck, staring at the stars. Sometimes she took out the harmonica and played softly, the notes blending with the sound of the waves. Other passengers would listen in silence, their faces turned toward the wind. Some cried, others smiled faintly. Music became their prayer, their fragile proof that something still connected them to the world beyond loss. When the ship finally reached Japan, the sight that greeted them was both familiar and alien. Tokyo was a city of bones. Smoke still rose from the ruins. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the gray sky. The smell of ash hung heavy in the air. Aiko stepped onto the dock and felt her knees weaken. The land she had dreamed of returning to no longer existed. Crowds of emaciated civilians moved through the rubble, searching for food, for family, for meaning. The sound of distant American jeeps echoed through the ruined streets. She wandered for days, searching for her home near Ueno Park. When she found it, nothing remained but a cracked foundation and a few charred stones. The piano was gone. The walls were gone. Everything that once held her life together had been erased. She stood there for a long time, the harmonica in her hand, her eyes burning with tears that refused to fall. Somewhere deep inside, a faint memory stirred, the promise she had made to Holden, to keep the music alive. That night she slept under the broken frame of what used to be her family's house. The stars above Tokyo were dim, muted by the smoke of rebuilding fires. She dreamed of the camp, of the songs, of Holden playing his harmonica under the rain. When she woke, she felt something shift inside her. The war had taken her country, her family, her home, but it hadn't taken her ability to begin again. In the following days, she searched for work. Food was scarce, and survival was a daily battle. But her nursing skills kept her alive. She joined a small relief group helping war orphans. Every evening after tending to the children, she would take out her harmonica and play softly by the fire. The children would gather around her, their faces lit by the flames, their eyes wide with wonder. Some clapped, some hummed along, some simply listened. It became their ritual, a quiet nightly promise that tomorrow would come. Each time she played, she thought of the camp, of the music that had once made prisoners weep and soldiers pause. She thought of Holden somewhere across the ocean, maybe sitting in a bar listening to the same melody, and though she never saw him again, she felt that in every note she played a part of him still listened. The autumn wind in Tokyo carried both smoke and salt, as if the ocean itself had drifted inland to remind everyone of what had been lost. The war had ended months ago, but the city still looked like an open wound. Wooden houses stood blackened and skeletal, their roofs caved in. Streets that once smelled of tea and grilled fish now reeked of soot and hunger. But amid the ruin, life had begun to crawl back, vendors selling rice from carts, children chasing one another barefoot through alleys, and musicians, ragged but unbroken, standing on corners playing battered instruments for coins. The notes of survival were everywhere if one listened closely enough. Aiko Nakamura walked through the city with quiet determination, her coat too large, her shoes too worn, and her heart too full of ghosts. She carried with her a single canvas bag containing the harmonica Holden had given her, the worn jazz sheet music that had survived the war, and a handful of dried rice wrapped in newspaper. For weeks after her return, she had volunteered at an orphanage near Shibuya, tending to malnourished children, washing their wounds, and singing lullabies she half remembered from childhood. Every night when the lights went out, she would take out the harmonica and play softly, the sound trembling through the dark hallways like a memory that refused to die. The children would listen in silence, and for those few minutes, the war disappeared. Yet there were nights when the silence after the music felt heavier than the ruins outside. There was no family to return to, no letters to answer, no familiar faces left. Her mother had died during the Tokyo air raids. Her brother Haruto's name appeared months later in an official report, killed in Burma. Her father had been buried long before the war, when Japan still believed in victory. She was the last of her family, a woman without a home in a city without a heartbeat. But music had always found her even in the darkest places. In the POW camp it had been a whisper of hope, in the orphanage it was comfort, and now in the broken city it became a reason to move forward. One evening as she walked home from the orphanage, she heard the faint sound of a trumpet drifting from a narrow alley. The melody was unmistakably Western, lazy, blue, and alive. She followed it, her steps quickening until she found a small group of musicians standing under the half-collapsed awning of a tea shop. They were young men, Japanese soldiers recently demobilized. Their uniforms patched with civilian clothes. One played trumpet, another guitar, another a homemade drum set built from tin cans. Their instruments were out of tune, their rhythm rough, but the soul of jazz was there. Mako stood at a distance, her breath catching in her throat. When the trumpet player noticed her, he lowered the instrument and smiled. "You like jazz, miss?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said softly. "I heard it in America." The men exchanged curious glances. Jazz was still a novelty in post-war Japan, something forbidden during the imperial years, and barely tolerated now by those trying to rebuild order. "You were in America?" the guitarist asked, surprised. "Not America," she replied carefully. "A camp. After Manila." The men's expression softened with understanding. They invited her to sit, and for the first time since her return she felt warmth that wasn't born of fire or fever. They played for hours that night, until the curfew bell sounded. The songs were imperfect, improvised, but they carried the pulse of life. When they finished, Aiko asked if she could try something. The trumpet player laughed kindly. "Can you play?" he asked. She took out her harmonica without a word. The men stepped aside and she began to play. The notes were uncertain at first, fragile, but they soon grew stronger, weaving into the rhythm the others created. People began to gather around the alley, women carrying baskets, soldiers, children clutching scraps of bread. The music spilled into the street like light breaking through clouds. For the first time since the war's end, the sound of joy returned to that corner of Tokyo. Word spread quickly. Within weeks, the little alley band became known around the neighborhood as the Rainbow Group, named after the song they played most often, "Over the Rainbow." They played outside tea houses, train stations, anywhere they could draw a crowd. Aiko's harmonica became the heart of their sound, delicate but unyielding. Sometimes she would hum quietly while playing, her voice like smoke curling through the notes. People tossed coins into a small wooden box, not just for the music but for what it made them feel, that maybe somehow there was a future worth imagining. By winter, a local cafe owner offered them a place to perform indoors. A tiny room lit by oil lamps with wooden walls still stained from fire. He said he wanted his customers to remember that laughter was not a crime. They played every night to soldiers, to laborers, to students returning from the ruins. The audience came for warmth and stayed for the sound. Jazz was still foreign, strange, a ghost of the enemy's culture, but in those nights it became Japan's too. It became the music of survival. Sometimes, after the last set, Aiko would sit alone at the piano in the corner. It was old, out of tune, one key missing, but she would press her fingers against it anyway, remembering her childhood lessons. Slowly, patiently, she began to teach herself again. Her touch was hesitant, but each note carried memory. The camp, the rain, Holden's voice saying, "Maybe one day you will play again." She whispered those words to herself often, as if saying them could keep them true. The months turned into years. Japan rebuilt itself faster than anyone could believe. New buildings rose from the ashes, neon lights appeared in Ginza, and American soldiers walked freely through the streets, laughing, buying souvenirs, listening to jazz records at bars. The occupation had brought humiliation, but also strange gifts, freedom of expression, the influx of Western art, and for Aiko, the chance to live without fear of silence. She watched the city change with cautious awe. The same music once played by her captors now poured from every radio. What had once made her weep, now made her smile. By 1951, Aiko had saved enough money to rent a small room above a bookstore in Ginza. She painted the walls herself, repaired the old piano she had rescued from a scrapyard, and hung a faded sign outside written in English letters she copied carefully. Rainbow Notes. It became her cafe, a place for musicians, writers, and dreamers who didn't fit in with the rigid New Japan rising around them. Every evening, she opened the doors, lit a few candles, and played. Sometimes she performed alone, other times joined by the same band she had met years before. The harmonica still sat on the piano, its silver body worn smooth by time and touch. It was her talisman, her proof that beauty could survive captivity. Customers came from everywhere. Japanese students curious about American culture, tired office workers seeking solace, and even American soldiers who had heard whispers of a Japanese woman who played jazz with the soul of a veteran. One night a tall man with graying hair entered, carrying a trumpet case. His Japanese was clumsy but his eyes kind. "You play here?" he asked. "Every night," she replied. He smiled. "May I join?" She nodded. Together they played in the mood, in the cafe filled with laughter and applause. Later when the man left he turned and said, "You play like someone who knows what loss sounds like." She smiled faintly. "Everyone here does." Her life was quiet, but it was enough. Each note she played was a prayer for those who didn't return. The nurses who died in field hospitals, the soldiers lost at sea, the children buried in rubble, and somewhere between the smoke of her memories and the rhythm of the piano, she always felt Holden's presence. She imagined him older now. Perhaps married, perhaps with children, sitting in a small house somewhere in Chicago, hearing jazz on the radio and thinking of the woman who once played in a camp half a world away. One evening, near closing time, a letter arrived at the cafe, its paper yellowed with age, the handwriting foreign but careful. It was postmarked from Illinois. Inside was a short note written in shaky English. "Dear Miss Nakamura, if this finds you, I hope you are well. I remembered your name because I wrote it once in my notebook, the day I gave you the music sheet. I have often wondered if you ever played again. I heard there is a cafe in Tokyo named Rainbow Notes. If that is yours, then I suppose you did. Thank you for reminding me that even in war, kindness can exist. I still play the harmonica sometimes. It sounds better when I remember you listening." It was signed simply James Holden. Aiko sat for a long time at her piano, the letter trembling in her hands. She felt the tears before she realized they were falling. She placed the letter carefully beside the harmonica on the piano, then closed her eyes and began to play. The song she chose was one she hadn't played in years. Over the rainbow, the melody rose softly, filling the empty cafe with warmth. Outside, the streets of Ginza glowed with neon and the hum of the rebuilt city seemed to sway with the rhythm of her song. The war was long gone, but its echoes lingered in every note. Yet those echoes no longer brought pain. They brought understanding. The past had been cruel, but it had also taught her the one truth she lived by now, that music could rebuild what war destroyed, that even the smallest kindness, a folded sheet of paper, a harmonica given in silence, could ripple through decades and continents, outlasting hatred, outlasting fear. She played until the lamps flickered low, until the city outside quieted, until she could almost hear another harmonica somewhere far across the ocean answering her tune. She smiled through her tears, her fingers gliding over the keys, and whispered softly into the night, "This is for you, for all of us who lived." The last note hung in the air, fading slowly into stillness. And for the first time since the war began, the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt like peace.